Hello, my name is Tobias Fenster, and I'm very happy to be able to talk again here at the amazing DynamicsCon. First of all, I want to thank all the sponsors, all the voters for DynamicsCon that have allowed me to get into the group of people who are happy to share content today. My name is Tobias Fenster. I'm the CTO of the Cosmo Consult Group. I'm also an MVP for business applications in Azure and a regional director for Microsoft. Again, thanks a lot for allowing me to speak today. And with that, I'd like to jump right into our topic for today. The topic for today is the Business Central on Docker, basics, tools, and advanced scenarios. So I'm going to talk about things that are hopefully interesting for beginners to get started, maybe people who went into the whole Docker area with not a lot of previous knowledge and who are using it to help to get started there. Then I'll share a couple of tools that are very helpful and then a couple of advanced scenarios. I'll try to keep the slides rather quick because I have a couple of demos I really want to show you so you can get a better feeling of how it really works. So let's get started with the absolute basics. This is intended for people who have never seen Docker or who have just started but don't really have an idea of the concepts. Docker is the leading cross-platform software container environment. That means that it's a way to put your software that you want to deliver into a package and deliver this to customers. Now, if we're talking about Business Central, that means that you're able, or Microsoft is actually able to create a package of the whole software that you need to run Business Central. That means SQL Server, the .NET framework, of course, Windows itself, and so on, so that you as a developer, you as a consultant, whoever is able to very easily spin up a new instance of Business Central. And then we have a Docker container and a Docker image. And the image is kind of the recipe for the container. It's a template. It has the minimum amount of operating system, of libraries, and of application binaries that are needed. And then if I want to run an image, that is what we call a container. So it's an instance of the image. It has an immutable base. I can't change the things in the image, but I can put changes on top of it. Also very important when you get started, a container is not a VM. It feels similar in some ways, but it really isn't. Especially you don't have a graphical user interface. You can't RDP into a container. That just doesn't work. The main components of a Docker world on Windows are the Docker engine, which is the thing that is doing the actual work. It's running the containers, pulling the images, working with all that. And then you have the Docker client side, either as the CLI or as Docker desktop, which is the client GUI that you can use. And that is used to communicate with the engine and make things happen. Now, a couple of other things. You sometimes might hear me refer to a Docker host, and that is the physical or virtual machine where the containers are running. So if you're running them on your local laptop, then the laptop is the Docker host. If you're running this on an Azure VM or on a VM somewhere in your data center or something like that, then that becomes the Docker host. Then we have a Docker registry. A Docker registry is the place that you can use to share your images. That means that someone else is able to use your image. You first have to upload it. That's called a push. And then others can download it, so do a pull on the images. And then a couple of reasons why you maybe want to use Docker, apart from the fact that Microsoft is really making it very easy and pushing for the usage of Docker in the Business Central world. It's a very easy way to create deployments and configurations in a very stable and reliable way. So the old problem, it works on my machine, but it doesn't work in the customer. It works in the test environment, but it doesn't work in the production environment. There are gaps that you can help to fill by using something like a Docker image, because that is always the same and will behave the same. You have better resource usage compared to VMs because a VM has more guest overhead than a container. So if you have the same amount of resources, you can only put in a number of VMs, and you can probably put in more Docker containers because they have less overhead. And outside of the Business Central world, there's also a big ecosystem of readily available images that you can just use. They are shared primarily through the Docker Hub, but in the meantime, Microsoft has also shared a lot through the Microsoft Container Registry. You can still find them on the Hub, but technically you will pull them from the Microsoft Container Registry. Okay, so that is the introduction. That should give you a basic idea of how things are working in the Docker world. Now I want to stress a couple of basics as well. The first one is, how can you do file sharing? So you have something on your host, you want to put it in the container, or you have something in the container and want to put it in the host. And there, mostly you have two options. You can call a command that is called docker cp for Docker copy, and that allows you to copy files from the host to the container or from the container to the host. That works anytime, just to bring them over. And then when you start a container, you can use the parameter -v for -volume for what is called a bind mount. And that allows you to share a folder between the host and the container. This can only be used during setup, but the benefit of that is that it's really a link between the two and not only a copy. I'll try to explain this a bit more. So if we have the standard file system, we're doing nothing. Then we have a folder ctemp inside of the container. And the blue square that you can see here is intended as the host machine. You can use the Windows Explorer and then dig down, see program data, Docker, Windows filter, whatever. So that's a cryptic path. And that might change in the future. You might be able to find your folder there, but this is actually something you shouldn't do, but because this is relying on internals of the Docker engine. And as I said, this might change in the future. You can't rely on it. If you do a docker cp, you have, for example, this file here inside of the ctemp folder in the container. Then you can do a docker cp, and that means it brings a copy into, for example, the cdata folder on your host. A copy means that if that file changes in the container, it obviously doesn't change in the host system because, well, it's a copy, so there's no link between the two. If we have the bind mount or the volume that I just mentioned, that means that ctemp inside of the container is pointing to another folder on the host. In that case, I'm pointing it to cdata container temp. And you can see in the bottom here how that command would look like. And that now means that the file in one of those is the same as the file in the other one. It really is identical. It's just a pointer to each other. So that means if I change that file either in the container or in the host, it will change also from the other point because it literally is the same file. So if one changes, it's the same one. It's just a different way to look at it. Okay, so much for sharing files. Then the other basic that I want to share with you is the options that you have to get a network connection into your container. That's probably interesting because if you start a Business Central container, chances are that you want to connect to the dev endpoint, you want to connect to the web client. So you need to have some way to have a network connection from your host or from somewhere completely different into the container. If you just do nothing, then the default setup allows you to connect from the host. So if you just run a container on your laptop and you only want to connect to it from the laptop, you're fine. And I'll show you in a second how that works. If you have a requirement to have, for example, a VM somewhere and you want to connect from a different system, then it gets slightly more complicated. You have basically two options there as well. You can do a port mapping. That means that you have a port in your container and you map that to a port on the host machine, and then you have a connection through those. The other option is to set up a transparent configuration, and that means that the container gets its own IP address and you can make it directly reachable on the network. Again, let's take a closer look at how that works. So if we have, for example, a host machine, it has an IP address of 10.1.1.1, and then we have a container. In that example, it would be a simple web server that is listening on port 80 and has that 172 internal IP address. That means that if I open a browser on my host machine, on my laptop or wherever, and I connect to that port, that of course works because I have a direct connection. But it gets more interesting if we have a different machine and that one tries to connect. It can't connect to 10.1.1.1 port 80 because nothing is listening there. It's still inside of the container. And at the same time, it can't use the internal IP address of the container because the second machine has no way of knowing where that is or making a connection there. So if you have that scenario, as I said, where you want to have a different machine connected, you can do two things. The first one, again, is to do a port mapping. In that example, I'm mapping port 80 in the container to port 81 on the host machine. And that means that if someone else wants to connect, they can talk to port 81 on that machine. That is forwarded to port 80 in the container, and they get the web server as expected. Still, they can't use the internal IP. They can't use port 80 because we only mapped it to port 81. You can, of course, also map port 80 of the container to port 80 on the host. I just wanted to show you here that it doesn't have to be the same port. It can also be a different one, but it can also be the same. The other option, as I said, is to have a transparent network. That one means that both are sharing the network connection. So that means that the container will automatically, if you have set it up in your network like this, will automatically get its own IP address and is directly reachable. So another machine can then directly talk to that one. The previous one, the port sharing, doesn't work anymore because we have now set it up differently. But I can directly connect to that IP address, to that port, and have a direct connection into the container from the outside. Again, this is relying on the setup of your network and has a couple of security implications. So this might or might not work for you. Okay, so much for networking as the second topic. Then a couple of things that I just want to briefly mention. You can set up resource limits. That means that you can limit the CPU, the memory, and the I/O, so the disk usage that a container can have. For example, you can say something like, I have 6 or 8 CPUs, but the container can only use 2 of them. I have 16 gigabytes of memory, but the container can only use 4 gigabytes, something like that. You have to remember that you can only set this up on container startup. When the container is running, there's no way to change this anymore. If you want to change it, you would need to throw it away and start a new one. Sometimes this is needed to start the Business Central container because SQL, which is running inside of the Business Central container as well, requires 3 gigabytes of memory. So that's the minimum that you need to have when you want to start a Business Central container. The other thing I want to briefly mention are different isolation types. There are 2 types, process isolation and HyperV isolation. Process isolation means that the isolation between the different containers and between the host and the container is only done through namespaces and resource controls. So it's kind of, it's the same machine, but it has different folders, so to speak, different areas where things are happening, but it's using the same kernel. It's using the same kernel of the operation system. A Hyper-V container now is slightly different. It uses a highly optimized dedicated VM, and that means that it has its own kernel for every container. You shouldn't think about this as a full VM because it really has a lot less overhead than a traditional VM, but it still has its separate kernel, and that has a couple of implications. Sometimes if you run into some weird corner cases with Business Central containers, it can help to switch the isolation mode, and then it maybe works in the other isolation mode. So that's always worth a try. Important to remember is that process isolation for now requires the exact same OS version on Windows 10 and on Server 2019. That means that if you're running, let's say, Windows 10 20H2, then you have to have a matching container image of the same version. For example, 1942, 1941, something like this, to make sure that process isolation really works. This has become a bit of a problem since the latest release because for Windows 10 21H1, built 1943 and newer, there are no base images for Windows Server 2019, and they also won't appear. This is an interesting area now because I'm recording this at the end of August. Beginning of September, there will be an official announcement. And by the time you're watching this, I think you already know this. But at the moment when I'm recording this, I haven't yet seen the full release. So I hope this is true. But this is the best of my knowledge by end of August. We have a workaround. We can use the 2004 image. That seems to work okay, but it's not officially announced or not officially supported, and it won't happen in the future. There won't be new images for new Windows 10 builds. But a good thing is that Windows 11 will actually allow mixed version process isolation. That means that you don't have to have the exact same OS version between the host and the container anymore. The only requirement is that the host needs to be newer than the image of the container. So you can't run a container that is newer than the host, but you can run containers that don't have the same version, but have an older version. And with that, I want to get to my first demo to show you how that works. I have pre-recorded my demos because some of them have a lot of waiting time, and to make sure that we can go through this quickly, I have pre-recorded them. So let's get started with the first one. What I'm doing here is I'm running a container, as you can see, in HyperV Isolation, and it has a build number 20,348. And if I just run that one on my Windows 11 machine to add that additional information, you can see inside of the container, we still have 2348 as a version. So as we said before, if you're running HyperV Isolation, it gets its own kernel that is governed by the image. So we have 2348. Now we're making a change, and we're now running this in process isolation. What that means is that we will share the kernel of the host. It's still the 20,348, but you can see here we're getting the 22,000 kernel now, because now in process isolation, it's using the same kernel as the host. And as you'll see, if we take a look at the OS version of my host, I'm now back in the host. If we take a look at the OS version, that is indeed the exact version that my host has. So this is a preview of the new feature that is coming up and will hopefully help a lot in the future. Okay, so let's get back to the presentation. Those were the basics. Now I want to talk about the basics of Business Central on Docker. We've now covered the general Docker stuff. Business Central works in a way that we have a generic image that is published by Microsoft that uses Windows Server Core. It has SQL Express, it has the .NET framework, and it has a lot of scripts. And those are shared between all of the Business Central versions and types. The different types are on-prem on Sandbox. So that means that we can reuse the generic image for all the different versions. Then we have the Business Central artifacts, which are also published by Microsoft. They contain the installer, databases, apps, test framework, and so on. So that means that if we use the generic image, put the artifacts on top and run a couple of scripts, which happens automatically, as you will see in a second, then we get a specific image for a specific version. For example, Business Central 18.4 in the German version on-prem. So what we need to do is we need to take the generic image, run the installer and the setup. And again, this is happening very easily in a script that I'll show you in a second. And with that, you have a specific image that you can reuse for as many containers as you want, or you could even push this into a registry that you set up to reuse it between different machines. So it really is a three-step process to get to your container in Business Central. You need to download the generic image, you need to download the artifact and build the specific image, and then you can run the container. The other thing for the containers is that they have a lot of different configuration options. For example, to start very easily, the username and password, whether it's multi-tenant or single tenant. You can have custom service tier or web client settings. You can connect it to an external SQL. There's really a lot of configuration options. And most of them are run through variables that you set when you start the container. So as different parameters if you want. Also, you can override each and every script in the container. So if something that is happening in the generic image isn't like you want it to happen, then you can always make a change to that script. But the problem becomes if you don't want to invest full time into understanding how all of this works, how should you know how this works? And the answer to that is the BC Container Helper. And that brings me immediately to the next part, which is the tools that we can use for Business Central on Docker. And probably the most important one is the BC Container Helper, formerly known as Nav Container Helper. That's basically just an extensive collection of PowerShell commandlets to make your life easier when you're working with containers on Business Central. They are not magic, they are not closed source or anything. There's an open source repository on GitHub, so you can very easily just use it, you can adapt it. Or if you want to create your own scripts, you can very easily take a look at how Microsoft is doing this, and then you can make changes like you want to and have to use them. And they are very useful if you want to run a container, create an image, use a container for compilation, for automated testing, for making a demo environment, whatever. So really, BC Container Helper is your go-to if you get started with Business Central on Docker. That will definitely make your life a lot easier. And with that, I want to get to my second demo, which is creating an image, creating a container, and then we use something which is called the new BC container wizard. So let me get back to my demos here. And we go back to the first demo. So what we're going to do now is, as I said, we're going to create an image. I'll first check there are no images on my machine, so nothing that we have pre-created. There's no container running on my machine. It's basically empty right now from a Docker perspective. I'll first import the BC container helper module, and it immediately tells me what the version is. That's very helpful if I'm wondering why something is not working. I can also take a look at the helper welcome text. That gives me an overview of all the different things that I can do. If you never used it, I would say it's worth taking 5 minutes to just scroll through to give you an idea of what the things are that you can do with the BC container helper. As you can see, it definitely is a lot. Now, as I said, the first thing that I want to do is create a new image, and that is done with the new BC image commandlet here. We'll give it an artifact URL because, as I said, we need to put in a specific artifact. And for that, we can also use the BC container helper. We need to let it know what the type is. In this case, on-prem, the country, I'll use US, and the version, and I'll use 18. So that basically gives me the latest 18 version. I want to create an image for later reusal, and I'll name it my BC. And with that, it gets started over here. And that's a point where I want to fast forward, as you've just now seen, because that takes a couple of minutes and I don't want to wait for such a long time. So let's take a look at what actually happened. You can see here, this is the point where we started, where we entered the command. The first thing is it's downloading the artifact that we need, 18.3 in the US version. It's unpacking it, and then it's starting to build the image. And the image has exactly that version as tag that you can see here. The first thing is that it downloads the generic image. As we said a couple of minutes ago, that is the base that we always need. And here, that's the moment when it has finished downloading the latest generic image. Now it's copying over all the artifacts that we need, and it's starting the actual image build process of the specific image. And it has 6 steps that you can see here. Most of them are very quickly done. But then the 5th step is where the actual installation is happening. And you can see here, it's installing Business Central, it's starting SQL, it's restoring the Kronos database, making setups, installing stuff, and so on. And then in the end, it says here, installation took 3 minutes at that moment, and we're done. And we have a new image, my BC on-prem 18.3, so-and-so US version. So that is now an image that I can use for creating a new container. If we take a look at the Docker images, you can see you have the my BC that we just created, and the one below it is the generic image that was downloaded in the beginning. So now we can create a new container because we now have the specific image that we want to use. We need to accept the end user license agreement. We need to give it a name. I'll just call it test. And I'll use the image that we just now created. And I'll use the tag that we have now created. So this is all that we need. I want to update hosts. That means that I can directly connect to it using the name. That is a neat trick that Business Central, the BC container helper does for you. And I would recommend that you do the same. So this is now starting. Again, it takes a bit, so I'm fast forwarding. And now we are done. Let's take a look again at what happened. This is the new BC container command. It starts here. You can see that it has the version that we expected. You can see that one again. It's an on-prem container. It's not multi-tenant. And then at the next couple of steps, you can see here that it's using process isolation because it's an exact match between the container image and the host. And then this is where the actual container start happens. So this is now happening inside of the container. And in the end, I get a URL. I get all that I need to connect. So if I now open a browser and go to that URL that we just got, I can then I'm already logged in because they used Windows authentication in that place. If I would use NAV user password authentication, as we'll do later, then I need to put in the username and the password. But here I've used Windows authentication. So we've now seen how we create an image, how we create a container. But you might wonder, okay, do I have to remember all the different configuration options? What else can I do? And there, something else comes in very handy that Microsoft has created, and that is the new BC Container Wizard. And I'll just start that one here. So it's just new BC Container Wizard. And that one starts a new window. Over here, and it asks me a couple of questions. So I don't need to remember what are all the different options. I just need to answer the questions here. So first of all, we need to accept the end-user license agreements. That is something that we always need to do. Then it asks me, should it be a local container or should it be a container on an Azure VM? I'll use a local container for now. And here you can see me mistype. And actually, and this is the right one. Now I can select what I want to use as authentication. In that case, I want to use username password authentication. I need to give a name for the container. I can keep the default BC server. I need to select the version. In this case, let's opt for a on-prem container. So that's option B. I need to select the country. I have the different options here that I can use, and the default is W1, but I'll go for a German one now. I don't want to use the test toolkit, so I'll keep the default here. I don't want to make changes to the base application, so I'll keep the default here. And also for the AL language extension, I also keep the default. I don't have a specific license file, so I also leave that blank. And I use the Chronos demo database that is inside of the container. So once again, let's use the default. I don't want this to be multi-tenant. Again, keeping the default. The DNS settings also work for me, so I can also keep the default. I don't want to use SSL because I won't make this available externally. And the isolation can also be automatically decided by the container helper. Here we have the memory limits that I mentioned in the beginning. I also keep that as a default, and I give it an image name to show you how to do that as well. Okay, and with that, I now have a PowerShell script, and I can just enter a name here, and I'll call it my container script.ps1. And with that, it is storing that one in a file. So what I can now do is I can keep that file. Let me make that a bit bigger. Zoom in here so you can hopefully better read. So you can see here all the different commands that we put in, and I can just use that script to create my container. And if I, at a later point, want to change, for example, the password, I can just make a change here in that script. Or if I want to change the country, I can immediately see where that happens, and then I can make a change and move that into an Austrian thing. So that's very interesting because I don't need to go through all of the wizard once again. The wizard helps me to understand what the different options are, what the different configuration types are that I can make. But then I end up with a script, and I can just use the script over and over again and make the little tweaks and the little changes that I might need. Okay, so that was the BC Container Helper. The other tool that I want to briefly introduce is Traffic, because if you're running multiple containers on a VM, if you're using the standard Azure VMs that Microsoft is providing on a link that I'll share in a second as well, then Traffic will automatically be used. So I want to quickly introduce how that works. Traffic is a reverse proxy, and that means if you have a Docker host and a client somewhere else, you can put traffic, the traffic proxy in between, and that helps to make the connections between the different machines. So for example, in that case, I'm making a request to /adev for the dev endpoint. And if I have set up traffic correctly, then it will know that there is a container running on the host, and that is redirecting the traffic that is going from the outside to ADEF into BCA on port 7049 in that container. So it's basically a mapping table between requests that are incoming and the things how they work internally on that host with the different containers. Now I can put easily a second container, and if I connect to BDEF, it will know that BDEF is a mapping to the container called BCB on port 7049, and that will make that connection. And now you can probably guess, I can have CDEF make a connection to BCC on port 7049, and that will be another container. You can probably also imagine that the same works for the OData port, it works for the web client, and so on. You just have to set up the rules in the right way, and then it works. And the good thing is that Microsoft already provides a quick start for that, so you don't have to understand and dig into details how that works, but instead you can just use that. And that is my first advanced scenario that I want to show you, that you can create multiple containers on an Azure VM. The first step would be to go to AKAMS get BC. As you can see here, wait for around an hour, and that will give you a pre-configured VM with traffic, with everything that you need for Business Central, including the BC container helper. With that, you can set up a central controlled environment that other people in your team, customers, whoever, can also use. So let's take a look how that works. I'll go back to my pre-recorded demos. And okay, so what I'm doing here is I'm going to AKAMS/getBC, as I said in the beginning, and that one will redirect me to the Azure portal and allow me to get that template set up. I need to enter a couple of information, and I'll quickly walk you through the most important ones so that you can get a basic example up and running. First of all, you need to select a subscription. That is important for billing. I'll create a new resource group for that particular demo for the DynamicsCon, and this is my traffic setup, so I'll name it that way. This will create it for me. I'm located in Germany, so I'll use the Germany West Central region, but you can, of course, use something else. I need to give a name for the VM. And I always need to accept the end user license agreement. I want to have remote desktop access from everywhere, so I'll add a star over here. I can make changes to the VM size. Maybe let's make it one size bigger because I want to add multiple VMs. I need to define a password. You can see the VM admin username is VM admin, the BC admin username is admin, but the password is the same. Now, if you want to use traffic, it's important to add in a contact email for Let's Encrypt here. That is important for generating the SSL certificates, and you will only get notified when it expires. So there's nothing that is happening here, basically, but you need to add it, otherwise it won't work. And we'll select Add Traffic Yes, because that's the demo that we want to do here, how to run multiple VMs. And then it's validating that everything works. You can take a look at the settings again and then create that VM. And as I said, that takes a while. So I'm once more fast forwarding in a second. It says here that the deployment is starting, and that will take a while. And then it says your deployment is complete. Now, when it is complete, you can go to the VM in here. So this is the actual virtual machine, as you can see here, and you can copy the DNS name that is generated. So you just hit the copy button on the right. And then you enter that one into the browser, get a new tab and just paste it in here. And with that, we are connecting to that virtual machine. And that is set up in such a way that we get a good overview of what is happening. So very quickly, you will see something like this. And you can see here, installation is not complete yet. And you can view the installation status. So the initial deployment has happened. But then a couple of additional scripts are also running, which are generating your first container image, setting everything up. And you can see here, you get a log of the things that are happening. Make that one a bit bigger as well. So this has now just started. And that also takes a couple of minutes, I think up to half an hour. So I'll fast forward again. And now in the end, this is what you're looking for. Desktop setup is complete. If you're at that stage, then it's done and everything has worked. You shouldn't see any red warnings or something like that. And you can take a look at the logs to see how it's once again installing everything that it needs on the host. It's installing the Business Central Container Helper again, so we can use it. And then it's generating an image, again, pulling the generic image at first, and then installing everything for the first image that we want to use. Yeah, that's where you can see here, the generic image has been downloaded, and then it starts the first container. So when it's done, you also have your first container up and running. And here you can see that the container setup is complete and you can already access it. And then it's setting up the desktop as well. So what we'll do now is we go back to the landing page, because it also provides us with an easy way to connect to that machine. Oh yeah, and you can see here all the setup information here. So this is your first container that is set up with traffic, the nav server container, and you can see here, this is the URL/nav server, which is then, as we showed before, internally mapped to go directly to that container. So if we just open that one, we get a connection again from the outside through traffic into the container that is running on that host, and we can log in using admin and the password that we defined in the initial Azure portal thing. So if we now log in, we should hopefully be fine. And you can see here, it's loading. We are connected, so that also works. Okay, so now we've seen how the first one works. Let's add a second one, because that was the whole point of the story, that we want to add a second container as well. And that's very easy. We just connect, as I said, through a landing page via RDP into that machine. I have pre-created that connection, so I can just open it here. And you can see here that it has a couple of additional images, including the traffic image and including the MyBC image. So again, this is the one that has been generated when we started. So what we want to do now is we want to create a second container, and we just use new BC container, accept the end user license agreement, give it a new name, DynamicsCon, accept that it might use the image that we just copied, MyBC, and then the tag over here. And we use nav user password authentication, because Windows authentication can be tricky across machines. So let's just use username and password here. And now it's starting again. As I said before, that takes a bit, so we'll fast forward. And when it's done, let's go up again. So yeah, we are here. We started it using the new BC container command, nothing about traffic, but BC container helper is clever enough to realize that use traffic was not specified, but it sees that traffic has been initialized, so we're going to use traffic. You can see a couple of rules that are defined here. Those are the mapping rules that I mentioned in the beginning, that it knows where to map internally. And then when it starts up, it shows us here how we can connect to that machine. So this is the web client URL for our second container, and you get all the different URLs that you might need for the different things in that additional output here. So if you want to connect to the dev service, to the snapshot service, whatever, you can use those URLs. And you also get the URLs on the landing page, so you can easily just use that link. Now we're going for the DynamicsCon container, and we'll again log in using the username and the password that we just defined. And now we are in our second container. So you've seen, if you just use the standard template by Microsoft, you don't need to worry about all the traffic things. I think it's important to understand how the concepts work, but you really can use it very, very easily. Another scenario that I want to share with you, and I'll go back to my presentation for that, is how you can persist the SQL database on the host. So what that means is, if you just keep the database in the container, if you for whatever reason lose the container or you delete it, you also delete the database. But maybe sometimes you want to keep the database if the container breaks, or you want to start a new container with the same data. And then it's interesting to just have the SQL database on the host. And I'll show you how that works as well. Let's go back to the demos and use our third demo. And I think I'll have to speed this up a bit because we might run out of time otherwise. So what I'm doing here is I'm stopping that container and moving the database files from the container out to the host. So I'll fast forward a bit here. You can see that here we're just copying the database files from the container into a folder on the host. So we now have it on the host and we can reuse them. And the next thing is we're going to set up a special database script, and then we create a container from that one. Again, I'll speed this up a little bit. That's too far. Okay, so let's take a look here. That setup script is documented on a couple of blogs by Freddie Christensen and also on the GitHub repository. And then you can find the right way to create that BC container over here. And we need to add a username and a password again. And then we can easily start it at that one. Again, we'll fast forward because it takes a couple of minutes. You can see here that it's actually attaching the database. That's the thing that is happening right now. So it's not recreating it, but it's attaching the one that it found on the host. So the database files are now already on the host. And when the container starts, it's just attaching those files. Again, we'll fast forward and take a look at the machine. I'll also skip that one and just show you that if we log in and take a look at the sales orders, you can see that we had 19, and I'll just post one of them to actually show you that it has worked. So I'll just hit post here. Ship an invoice. Oh, that was too far. So you can see now that we have 18 sales orders now. And what I'm then doing is I'm removing that container again and then start a new container that is connected to the same database files, because then we should still have 18 and not 19 or 20 as it is initially, but it's reusing the same database. So we should see that we have 18 still. So we're doing the same thing as before, but creating a new container. And by virtue of that script and that volume, it's now using the database files that are stored on the host, entering the username and the password. I'll fast forward again. Now, if we just log in, we should hopefully see that we have 18 over here. And here it appears. Exactly. So you can see that we have reused the files on the host. So I skip the last demo for the sake of time. That would have been how to connect a container to an external SQL server. If you're interested, let's go to the question and answers area right after the session. I can show you how that works. That allows you to just connect to a different SQL server. To wrap it up, just a couple of best practices. Something that's very important: save the script, not the container. A container might break, and you might have a problem there. Just create a script as I shown in the beginning, then you're always able to recreate the container, put your database files on the host, or use an external SQL server, and then you won't run into any problems. Out of experience, I would say that it's a best practice to have a dedicated expert, a dedicated team to handle the Docker stuff in your company or in your team. Those are often the same people who are handling the Azure DevOps stuff, because those are technical people usually. Because in the Docker world, if you don't know what you're doing, if you're just copying scripts from somewhere, that probably means that you shouldn't do it. So it's important to build up the skill, but not everyone needs to have the skill, but maybe just a dedicated expert. You should standardize and automate, and I would suggest to not do it on every laptop, because those tend to behave slightly differently and you might run into problems. So if possible, use a central environment and standardize there. And if it doesn't work, you should create a good issue on the GitHub repository for NAV Container Helper or for NAV Docker, and then people will get help. Or if you've now seen that this is actually a complicated problem and you want to use an external service instead of understanding for yourself how that works, please also get in touch with me, get in touch with Cosmo Consult, because we're offering that kind of thing. With that, I would like to say thank you for your interest, for listening to this, to that session. I would be very happy to welcome you in the Q&A area right afterwards. And once again, thank you to DynamicsCon and for all the voters for allowing me to speak today. There was one question that I didn't answer in the live chat, which is how to handle the situation that Docker Desktop no longer is for free. First of all, I want to say that the cheapest subscription is only $5. So at least in my opinion, you should certainly look into just getting that, because they are also creating a product. And as someone mentioned on the chat, most of us are creating software and selling software. So I think it's very fair value for the money if you pay the $5 for a monthly subscription. If you really have to, then there's also an option to just install the Docker engine and the Docker client. And in cases where I need that, I'm heading over to AJ Kaufman's blog, who has explained how to do that. The other option also is to follow the instructions that you find on the official documentation site, how you can install the Docker engine on Windows Server. I think that should probably also work on Windows 10 by now. I haven't tried it for a very long time because I'm using Docker Desktop on the client. So yeah, you can do that as well, and just use the installation instructions for Windows Server. Yes, and as Waldo mentioned, I'm not working for Theta, I'm working for Cosmo Consult. So whatever went wrong, errors can happen. So unfortunately, the presenters, or the organizers, the producers put a wrong company name into the footer. I'm not working for Theta, I'm working for Cosmo Consult. And the other thing that I wanted to mention is someone asked about getting started. I really would think about using an external offering. As I said, we're offering that as Cosmo Consult. But if you talk to people who have already done this, it really might be worth your money, because it takes a lot of time and understanding and fixing issues if you're doing it by yourself. So it might be useful to do that. And then we have another question now, if I would recommend to look into Docker Swarm for a centralized environment. To be honest, no, I wouldn't recommend that. I think it's very clear that the community in Docker in general has moved toward Kubernetes. I'm still in favor of saying that Docker Swarm would be the better solution, but if you're the only one using it, then it also can become a problem. So the improvements are only working on Kubernetes. Docker Swarm is more or less left as it is. There's still some small progress, but not a lot. And if you need support, it's always very difficult to get people to understand what you're doing. So Docker Swarm is a great solution if you know what you're doing. I'm still very happy with the things that we are running. But if I would start now from scratch, I most likely would look into Kubernetes. It also has a couple of issues because of the way that the Business Central images are working and Business Central containers are working. But still, that's a different issue. And I currently would suggest to really look closely into the Kubernetes area instead of going forward to Docker Swarm. Connecting to an external SQL server, actually, I wanted to show that, sorry. The thing that you can do is you just add a couple of parameters. I'll add a short blog post on that one, how that works, but really it's not a big issue. It would have been a 90-second demo, but I just ran out of time. But really, it's only a couple of parameters that you need to add: the server name, the instance name, username, and password, and then you can connect it to an existing SQL server as well. Okay, let me quickly scroll through the questions. Brian says, getting HyperV to play nice on a Windows VM. Yes, that can sometimes be an issue, depending also on the hardware. It's below the VM, but if you can go for process isolation, then that doesn't matter. So in the future, you should have an easier time. Okay, that's it. I'm running out of time, and the next presenters or the next sessions are starting. Thanks a lot again for watching. Thanks a lot for your questions. And if you have any follow-ups or you want to take a look at our service, please feel free to get in touch through Twitter, through email, through LinkedIn, whatever. I'm happy to have any discussion on Business Central on Docker. Again, thanks a lot. Take care and have fun for the rest of the conference.